Minister, the Dáil focus is clearly elsewhere yesterday and today, but I really want to use the next 2 hours to bring it back to where it exactly needs to be. And it's not in this Dáil chamber, it's actually just 5 minutes away on Mount Street, where scores of asylum seekers are again sleeping rough. On Mount Street, right in front of the International Protection Office, in really what can only be described as a dystopian illustration of where our state is going and unfortunately where it is at the moment. By the time the Dáil returns after the Easter recess, their numbers will undoubtedly have grown. People coming to this country seeking safety from persecution, sleeping rough with no running water, no sanitation, no toilet facilities and at risk of violence. Minister, these are human beings, and I think oftentimes that's lost in the discussion and in the debate and the narrative that we hear in this chamber, on our radio waves, on social media, and unfortunately within government policy itself. Human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity, with respect, and your government has repeatedly failed to do that. I welcome the fact that you will not be opposing this motion today, but I do find it interesting because the first point of our motion says that the government agrees that its failure to provide material reception conditions to international protection applicants is unlawful. So effectively, what you're doing is putting your hands up here today and saying that yes, how you've been treating these people is unlawful. And I'll be really interested to hear your statement on that matter, because I don't know whether I've ever come across that instance within the Dáil. And not only your statement, but what I want is action and to hear what measures you're going to put in place. There can really be no confusion in relation to government policy on this matter. Offering asylum seekers basic accommodation is not optional. It is not some gift the government can decide to withhold. It is the law. And you are in continuing and willful breach of the law, and you have actually agreed in that regard. Under EU and domestic law, the state has an obligation to provide material reception conditions for asylum seekers. Material reception conditions include meeting the basic needs like accommodation, food, clothing, and access to personal hygiene facilities. The High Court has already ruled on this twice. In April 2023, because this is an issue that has persisted for over a year, the High Court found that the state's failure to provide material reception conditions to an international protection applicant was unlawful. Again, in December last, the High Court reiterated that the state has a clear duty to provide material reception conditions. Mr. Justice Ferter said, as a matter of EU law, the state remains under a continuing mandatory obligation to provide international protection applicants with basic needs, including accommodation on an uninterrupted basis from the point at which qualifying persons apply for international protection. Accommodation on an uninterrupted basis. It really could not be any clearer. But what has the government continued to do? You've told asylum seekers there is no room at the inn and offered them an extra €75 in lieu of accommodation. This does not satisfy the state's clear legal and moral obligations to these vulnerable asylum seekers. It comes nowhere close, and Minister, you know that. And unfortunately, that is why I have said, and I'll repeat it again, I believe that the policy of this government and the policy of you, Minister, and your department, unfortunately, is to use those individuals suffering and being treated absolutely diabolically by this state on Mount Street and elsewhere across the country as a warning and a symbol and a sign to people who want to come here, who need to come here seeking refuge. What you're saying to them is, don't come because we've nowhere to put you. And there can be no other logical answer to that. And I would really hope today that you stand there and you tell me how I am wrong, because it would really break my heart to think that we live in a country where that could be a defined government policy. But I can see no other explanation, Minister. The Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, has repeatedly said in the media that there's issues with accommodation. and that he hopes anyone who's considering coming in here, coming over to Ireland, takes that into consideration and doesn't come here because of the pressures we're facing with accommodation. He has repeatedly said it in the media and on the floor of this Dáil. And yet, we've also been told that there are beds. So whilst the government continues to state that there are no beds, Laura Fletcher from RTE has numbers from the department that clearly says that there's 2,180 empty beds lying within the iPass system. And I hope you'll clarify that today, Minister, because this has been it's been put on the record a number of times, and I haven't actually heard any clarifying statements from you on that. You've clarified in relation to Ukrainian accommodation. You've conducted an audit of Ukrainian accommodation and have identified some additional spaces, but I haven't heard any comments or discussion about an audit of an iPass accommodation. And I would really appreciate, actually, if you have those figures, that you would give them to us. Because I think the government needs to be transparent in this. If the state, if the public purse is paying for empty beds to lie empty, well, we have men whose tents were collapsing under the snow, who had to use the streets and the paths to go to the toilets on. Children actually involved in that as well. If you have a situation where that is happening and there's beds lying empty, I think you need to tell us why. And you need to tell us exactly how many there are and why those decisions have been made. And I think that's the least that we should expect from you today. I mean, it doesn't... you know, you've essentially gone from a position where, when you came into government, your promise and your commitment was to get rid of direct provision. And it's a far fall from that ideology to where we are today. And I understand there's been challenges. I know it's been hard. But I think that those men, and indeed anyone who's coming here to seek refuge, I think they have been failed badly by government. And I hope the fact that you've acknowledged that what you've been doing is unlawful and you are not opposing our motion, I hope that now finally that you will be saying, okay, you got it wrong and here's how you're going to make it right. Because I really don't believe anyone in this country, or the absolute majority of people, believe that it's okay to leave people on the side, no matter where they're from, to leave people on the side of the road like that without the supports that they need. I remember when I was in Sydney, I went out shortly after the Olympics, and at that stage they had essentially, government had made a decision to sweep up all those people, all the homeless people off the streets and hide them in advance of the Olympics, so the eyes of the world didn't have to be subjected to that. And I honestly, hand on heart, never thought we'd reach that day here. And unfortunately, I think we have. And I do hope that you will be telling us exactly what you're going to do. So the questions we need answers to today, Minister, are: will you publish the audit of iPass and Ukrainian asylum seeker beds? Will you tell us where they are and why they are empty? Will you tell us when you're going to be establishing those 6 reception centres? When are you bringing to Cabinet the revised white paper? What is your plan? Because it is clear, as a wealthy country and a country in Europe, we will always have immigration and people who seek refuge here. That is not going to lessen, it is not going to go away. And we need a government that is capable of managing it, and managing it in a humane way. And I don't think that that's happened to date. And so I hope that your response will exactly outline all those measures and address all those issues that we need to see. I think what we don't want is that the shameful treatment of these vulnerable international protection applicants continues to be a stain on this government, one that unfortunately could potentially become an indelible mark, and one from which, as a state, we will have as a reminder of how we failed people who really needed our assistance. Thank you.
And first of all, I want to thank my colleague, Deputy Jennifer Whitmore, for her work on this motion and on this issue. Minister, the desperate situation on Mount Street has been a growing humanitarian crisis for months, with hundreds of men and boys sleeping in the cold in completely unsanitary conditions, which has led to the spread of disease in recent weeks. Local activist groups and volunteers have been working tirelessly to help these men to provide food, warm clothes and blankets. Where was the department? Where was the emergency response? Where was the urgency that this crisis required? Why was it only in the past week that a capacity review was undertaken to find the number of vacant beds available for asylum seekers? How can you stand over that? When over 1,000 people have been sleeping rough in sub-zero temperatures, fending for themselves on the streets of Dublin, this government should be ashamed of themselves. And right when we think that the situation has reached rock bottom, that your department's treatment of these people could not get any worse, what happens? Ahead of St. Patrick's Day, the hundreds of people on Mount Street are shuffled onto buses to be transported to new accommodation, with no transparency on where they're going or what to expect. Clearly, giving these people the impression and the hope that things were going to get better. But the reality of the situation in Crooksling was stark. The best that the government could apparently provide were more tents isolated in the middle of nowhere, far from the volunteers who supported and protected them, and left with a gang of balaclavaed people shouting racist abuse outside the gate. Minister, it shouldn't require much critical thinking from the government to realise that isolating people from their very limited support base will not make them safer. And for the government to defend the conditions in Crooksling by saying that access to health services and transport links to Dublin are to be put in place in the future is laughable. Why on earth was that not done before you bust hundreds of medically and physically vulnerable people into an isolated area? It's nothing short of negligent. Minister, you need to listen to the people that you sent there, to the people who within a number of hours were walking 19 kilometres back to Mount Street. Why? Back to an area with no sanitation or security, because ultimately they actually felt safer there than the accommodation that you provided. No one's saying that this is easy, that the war in Ukraine didn't put incredible levels of pressure on the international protection system. But instead of acting on the recommendations of the Catherine Day report after that fact, instead of immediately starting the work on the 6 state reception centres and 700 modular homes, the government's response has been shambolic, with no sign of medium or long-term planning. If you'd followed the recommendations of the report, the 6th centre would be delivered this year. Not only are we nowhere near even having one, you're refusing to even disclose the location of the centres until after the local elections. Playing politics with people's dignity, their health and their fundamental human rights, and everybody can see it for what it is. It's a complete and utter disgrace. Not only do you seem to be either reluctant or incapable of delivering the much-needed reception centres, it also seems there is available accommodation that you're just not using. In a PQ response to me yesterday, you stated that there were 3,100 potential vacancies within the accommodation centres contracted for Ukrainians, with 1,300 of them appearing to be usable. It's not good enough that people are left in the cold, being physically and verbally abused while these beds lie empty, all because the department doesn't seem to have bothered to even check the capacity until March. The rise in the number of asylum seekers is often phrased as a crisis, but I don't think that that's helpful, because the reality is there will always be wars and displacement, there will always be people fleeing persecution and people seeking a better life. People have a right to seek protection here, and we have a legal obligation to provide it. And as an economically successful and safe country, Ireland will be a destination for people. Ireland needs to be able to handle this number. What we need is a coherent plan from government on this issue, and we need it quickly.
Yeah, what we've seen over the past week, where IP applicants who were camped in Mount Street, some still are, were bussed to Crooksling. The optics minister of that were that the problem, they were being hidden from international eyes for the St. Patrick's Day festival. And it's an appalling way to treat human beings. The direct provision system, which was to be phased out, is now overwhelmed and can't cope with the new intake, with over 5,500 people who've been through the immigration system and have the right to remain. The problem is that there's nowhere for them to move on to. At the centre of this is the housing crisis. We've repeatedly called for an all-of-government approach that would need a plan. That would mean, instead of outsourcing this issue to the private sector and then throwing buckets of money at it, at what has now become a crisis. It would instead mean government had to govern. Instead, the Department of Children, Integration, Equality and Youth were given a one-dimensional task and have been overwhelmed. It is like this coalition government are risk-averse and are trying to compartmentalise this issue when in fact it's multifaceted. We seem to be in a permanent state of emergency. That emergency is not of the making of those who have fled the war in Ukraine or those who have applied for international protection. The use of commercial buildings such as hotels or disused industrial buildings, which otherwise would not be used for housing, is where the focus has been for accommodation of IPAS and Ukrainian refugees. With calls for expressions of interest for private sector accommodation from the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. Normal planning rules have been suspended or relaxed, as have normal procurement processes, such as public tenders. There's a feeling that money is being thrown at the issue without any of the normal checks and balances. I was informed at a recent Public Accounts Committee meeting, for example, that providers have to be tax compliant. When I pressed for what other controls are required, it seems that's it. The logical conclusion is that someone, for example, with a criminal background who is tax compliant could qualify. Some of those who have won tenders appear not to be people of means. There are legitimate questions about where the money is coming from those for those who purchased those buildings in the first place. Because of a European court judgment and the heavy-handed way it was applied here, it's now impossible to find out who the beneficial owners are of some of these companies. Even a cursory glance shows that there are companies within companies in a web that is impossible to untangle. We have no way of knowing where the money is coming from or who is financially benefiting from these contracts, in some cases benefiting from multiple contracts. And Minister, it matters. The fact that the department process is so internal and so secretive means we just don't know how it's been handled. This is not to say that most providers are not completely legitimate, but vast sums of money are being made. And, you know, they're very vulnerable people at the centre of this. There's no doubt our contribution to the war in Ukraine is a humanitarian one, primarily taking in displaced people. There's no doubt that this will cost money, and I accept that. There is no doubt they have international obligations when it comes to international protection applicants, but that also will cost money, and I also accept that. But that does not mean we dispense with the basics like value for money, good controls, good governance, or our humanitarian obligations. This is a very internal process, as I said, used by the department. This is not just an issue of communication. It's about a lack of any kind of cross-government plan or a robust process or procurement controls that involves control of costs. This is not just an issue of communications. As long as we accept that from government, we will get more of the same. What we're really looking at is the symptom of something that is much bigger, and that is, at the heart of it, is the housing crisis, the crisis of inadequate public services. And I ask again, Minister, where is the plan? I mean, I'm looking at people who've been able to buy who don't have means, been able to buy a building for 1.2 million, getting a $250,000 a month to run it. Why aren't we considering, for example, buying places? And then managing rather than throwing it out there to be mismanaged in some cases. And there is complete lack of any kind of a cross-government plan, and that is what we've been calling for right from the word go. This has to be a whole of government approach. It can't be compartmentalised into your department.
Thank you, Las Ceann Comhairle. Ireland has long stood by the principle in international and European law that those who need to seek refuge must be afforded the right to do so, and afforded so humanely, fairly, and according to the rules of the international system that we strive to uphold. And recent years have seen an unprecedented combination of contributory factors, some once-off, others due to fundamental shifts in migration patterns over the longer term. And together, between those fleeing the war in Ukraine and the increasing numbers of people seeking international protection in Ireland, the state has mobilised to provide accommodation to over 100,000 people in the past 24 months. And the challenges facing us in this regard are increasing. January and February of this year were the highest numbers of monthly international protection applicants on record, as many people now claim international protection in 6 weeks as they did previously in a year prior to COVID. And at the same time, accommodation contracted by my department faces opposition. Sometimes it's protest, sometimes it's the blocking of access, sometimes it's as far as acts of criminal arson. And all this acts to further restrict the available pipeline of accommodation. And these trends, these challenges, they're not unique to Ireland. Across Europe, we see other countries looking to grapple with migration as well. And indeed, after many years of receiving comparatively few international protection applicants, the last 2 years has seen Ireland move in line with what other European countries are receiving on a per capita basis. I want to be very clear. The right to claim international protection is a human right. A person who comes here has a right to make an application in protection and to make their case. This is fundamentally a humane act, and we must be proud as a country to be able to provide that right. As I've said before, the old system by which we process individuals' international protection claims and accommodate people while their claim is being adjudicated on, it's no longer fit for purpose. And that's why myself and Minister McEntee have been working to reform that process, and it'll be on that basis that I'll be bringing the new approach to the provision of accommodation to Cabinet next week. I want to speak specifically about the situation on Mount Street and the move to Crooksling on Saturday. Since last December, the state has been unable to provide accommodation to all male international protection applicants who have arrived in Ireland seeking it, and as everybody knows, this challenge is becoming increasingly more difficult. Although the majority of those who haven't been offered accommodation are not rough sleeping, a growing number have been rough sleeping recently, and many of whom have congregated at the International Protection Office at Mount Street. The situation there is entirely unacceptable and has been worsening in recent weeks. This was rightly highlighted by many Oireachtas members, by councillors, as well as NGOs I would have engaged with directly and who provide direct support there. As a result, I instructed my officials to examine what emergency, immediate measures could be put in place to offer at least 24-hour security, along with access to toilet and shower facilities, food and health services, and again, working in the absence of enough available beds coming through, particularly for adult males. The site at Crooksling was immediately available, as it's already state-owned. It has a full suite of security measures put in place, and it is adjacent to public transport in and out of Dublin. The suggestion that the move to Crooksling was in any way linked to St. Patrick's Day is entirely wrong. The additional facilities at Crooksling became operational last Saturday. As soon as the site was ready to receive international protection applicants, I sought to have them moved there. Basic as it is, the availability of toilets, of showers, of regular meals, of access to health and other services in a secure and protected location is a far better one than the one that exists on Mount Street. My sole focus was ensuring a safe, secure and service site for those who are unaccommodated. In a crisis situation like this, nobody is thinking of the date, nobody is thinking of visuals. I do have to address some of the rampant misinformation which was shared over the weekend. The shared photo of a filthy toilet purporting to show the only toilet on the site. Entirely untrue. The suggestion that there were no indoors areas for those staying there, that's not true. The suggestion that there was no food available on Saturday, that's not true. Crooks Lane has an indoor area, it has facilities to charge phones, catered food is available, washing machines, 15 toilets, 6 showers, a full suite of security. And additional facilities like an on-site kitchen are being provided now. Services are and have been provided from this weekend, health services, access to other social services as well. Again, the site at Crooks Lane is basic, but it is an improvement on the unacceptable situation at Mount Street. And I understand the frustration felt by those who've come to Ireland seeking shelter. And I accept that we're failing to meet their basic needs. And as Minister, my department, Minister O'Brien, we are all working as hard as we can to address that situation. 3 years ago, we set out the white paper to end direct provision, a policy designed around 3,500 people seeking international protection each year. The landscape has changed radically since then, with additional 100,000 people seeking different types of protection since then. Those are numbers that were unimaginable in early 2021. The challenges facing us at the moment are a function of the system we operate, and as the system has grown, it's become harder to reform. And it's clear to me and colleagues across government that the scale of the challenge now demands a response of a similar scale. I'll be bringing the new accommodation strategy to Cabinet next week. The strategy will set out the measures to activate additional resources of the state to bring this situation under control. In the broadest sense, it will be about moving away from the current over-reliance on private providers for accommodation and to ensuring that there is a stock of state-owned accommodation. It will ensure better quality of accommodation, better control of the accommodation pipeline, better value of money for the taxpayer, and crucially, some choice over location for accommodation. It will also include immediate measures to address the current crisis, measures which, if implemented, can deliver additional accommodation within months. And it will aim to give the state greater management over the stock of international protection accommodation, again in terms of location, distribution, costs, delivery of services, and the consideration of impact on communities. And finalising this policy has taken longer than I would have liked, but I'm confident that it will take us out of the current unacceptable situation. I note that the motion makes reference to vacant beds within the IPAS system, and I can understand that there is an appeal about the idea that there's some simple solution here and that for some reason government just could resolve the situation, but for some reason has chosen not to. I have to be clear, it is totally inaccurate to say there are available beds at scale within the IPAS system. Every week we get 450 to 500 people seeking international protection. We got it last week, we'll get it this week, we'll get it next week. And when Deputy Whitmore speaks about 2,000 available beds, those 2,000 beds will be gone in 4 weeks' time. We plan ahead. We plan ahead to ensure so we can ensure that there will be beds available for families, for children in the coming weeks. It would be grossly irresponsible for us not to do so. Deputy Kern spoke about beds in the Ukrainian system, like they're interchangeable with the international protection system. After 24 months here now, it's deeply frustrating for me to hear that deputies are saying that the two systems are fully conflatable. You know well that it is not possible to ask somebody who has, to demand somebody who has a Ukrainian contract to demand that they take international protection applicants. It's not possible. We are actively engaging.
When people are intense.
You have 40 minutes, I have 10, if you would let me finish my point. We have been actively engaging with providers on the Ukrainian side, seeking that they transfer to the international protection side. We've had some successes in it. We'll continue to do that. But this notion that there are 3,000 easy beds there that we can move, you absolutely implied that this was something that was easily done. And we have major challenges on the accommodation side, and it is not helped when people pretend there are easy solutions to address here. There are no easy solutions. If there was easy solutions, there wouldn't be people left unaccommodated right now. Glasgow Corla, to conclude, I will thank, as I always do when we discuss migration, I will thank the many deputies on government, in opposition, in parties and independents who work closely with me, who work closely with Minister O'Brien and my department to support the delivery of much needed additional accommodation across the country. I know across much of this House there's a strong desire to address this situation. There's a strong desire for Ireland to meet its international requirements. I want to be clear that it is no way acceptable to me or my department that people remain unaccommodated. Every effort is made by my department to support those who are coming to this country to claim international protection. And the best way in which we can change this situation is through an accommodation strategy that moves our alliance from the private sector to having a core of state-owned accommodation, and we will set this out in detail next week. Thank you.
I was sitting down this morning to prepare the words to think about what we're going to offer today, and you're looking at some of the images from last week of people in our international protection system being bussed up to Crooksling and then walking back. Hearing testimony from the advocates, remembering the conversation we would have had with those sleeping in the tents over the last number of months, I couldn't step away from the question of when did we become so cruel? And Minister, it isn't my intention to personalise this issue at all, or in any way lay blame squarely at your feet. In fact, I believe that using you as a scapegoat to spare their blushes is squarely the intention of your colleagues in government, certainly not us. In the Social Democrats, we have for over 2 years, that 24 months you referred to, called for an all-government approach. To the extent that it was we who raised your own letter to Cabinet colleagues seeking to help in the matter. We raised that in the Dáil. And yet here we are again today, Minister, where emotions and the failures of international protection systems to be discussed and has left both yourself and your party colleague, Minister O'Brien, to defend what we do consider the indefensible. Where is Minister Darragh O'Brien? Where is the cross-party Cabinet colleague? What if the Minister would be left the sole responsibility on a motion like this today? We need more evidence that there is a whole-of-government approach to this catastrophe. We need a commitment to the whole-of-government response to this, and a commitment patently isn't there. In fact, every time I hear a Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael backbencher on the radio talking about the issue, it's your name they're mentioning, Minister. They don't mention their own Cabinet colleagues, it's your name specifically. In 2018, Ireland signed up to the EU Reception Conditions Directive and placed it into Irish law. That set out basic standards that as a state we've committed to, namely ensuring that applicants have access to housing and food, and that we as a country agree to give particular attention to vulnerable persons, especially unaccompanied children and victims of torture. What we are clear on is that Ireland needs to meet these basic conditions for those seeking international protection here. For over 2 years now, we've been operating a state of emergency, on full knowledge that the day will come where we do not have enough accommodation for those arriving seeking refuge. We cannot allow the situation to become normalised from a moral or a legal standpoint. This obligation is on the state, not just on your department, but on all of government. We need leadership from the Taoiseach, whoever that may be next week, from the Minister for Housing and from your Cabinet colleagues. However, your colleagues across the Cabinet are demonstrating a clear disregard for any degree of collective responsibility. And although cruel in its own way, that very obviously is not the cruelty I was referring to in the opening statement. Ministers, none of us can deny that a humanitarian and a public health crisis is intensifying because of the failure of the government to provide adequate accommodation to asylum seekers. I noticed that you said that you're not meeting your basic minimum standards, and I think that's a fair admission and a welcome, Minister. But there is an obligation on government to provide adequate accommodation to asylum seekers that is warm, that meets their basic needs. You can say you are meeting the minimums, Minister, but the minimums are by no means adequate, and the consequences of what is effectively a policy of state-sponsored hardship as a form of deterrence are being felt by real people every day in the streets of Dublin. I'll say that again, state-sponsored hardship as a form of deterrence, as echoed by the words of Leo Varadkar when he said, people don't come here, we've no more room. To come here, you'd be in a tent at the side of a mountain. There are now more than 1,300 international protection applicants without accommodation in Ireland. The impression seems to be given that the Mount Street encampment only emerged in the last number of weeks, and we know that's completely untrue. It began last April. Hundreds of international protection applicants are sleeping in tents in laneways that are off the grid. You mentioned the fact that most people who are not offered a tented accommodation are somewhere else. Do we know where they are? Has anybody answered that question yet? Where are the rest of the accommodations? There are no toilets on Mount Street, there were no running water, there were no sanitation facilities on this tent encampment that grew up over the last year. But why not? Like, why not? When did we become a society that doesn't offer people a place where they can go use the bathroom? That was allowed permit for over a year. Whose responsibility was it? Was it Dublin City Council's? I certainly seen nobody dragging them in and asking why that wasn't catered for. They were left in increasingly unsanitary and dangerous conditions at risk of severe weather and violent attack. Tents at the same location were set alight by arson attack by violent racist mob in 2023, and I still haven't seen anybody dragged before the court and held accountable for that yet. In a letter to the Irish Times on March 13, 2024, infectious disease registrar Dr. Ralph Hurley-Dwyer said in recent weeks he has looked after multiple young men, international protection applicants, hospitalised with serious medical conditions as a result of sleeping outside in the cold. Dr. Dwyer continued, the management of these conditions require lengthy and costly hospital stays. In March 2024, Dr. Angay Scouse, Medical Director of the Safety Net Primary Care, told RTE the conditions on Mount Street were inhumane and said she had treated people at the site with multiple serious health issues. Ministers, both ministers, all ministers in fact, parliamentary debate often involves people who are opposing views or belief systems, but I know full well that isn't the case here, so please do help us understand how these outcomes, this horrific treatment of vulnerable persons, was deemed to be acceptable for so long. Or even allow me to ask a different question. If the roles were reversed, Minister, if we set into the position that you now hold, or you set over the cross hours, would you settle for the excuses that are now being offered? Would you allow us to squabble over what number of toilets met a threshold of decency for frightened humans placed at the foot of a mountain over a bank holiday weekend? Would you talk about the fact that one dirty toilet wasn't demonstrative, was false news or whatever you called it, but didn't actually acknowledge the fact that that very toilet was on the site though, it was there. There may have been other toilets, but that filthy, horrible toilet was one of the ones that was offered to those humans who were sent there. Would you recoil as we accuse our advocates of misinformation in preventing these scared people's fears of cold, of disease, of harassment or a lack of nourishment in these isolated encampments of tents and tarpaulin? Direct provision will be 25 years in existence in 2025. Again, I won't personalise it, but certainly throughout at least 15 of those years, I've walked alongside members of all progressive members of the left in this chamber and elsewhere in this country in calling for an end to that horrific practice. Would any of us on those marches, at the information sessions that were hosted by refugees, other support groups, would any of us for a moment have accepted that as war intensified globally, as temperatures increased and led to famine in the Horn of Africa or elsewhere, would any of us as those marches have permitted then that the demand for sanctuary for those human catastrophes increases, that our standards would plummet so far? We would not have. To do so is neither progressive, it certainly isn't my understanding of Christian, it is just cruel. I'm conscious that as we have this debate, mother and baby home survivors are once more protesting their exclusion from small redress scheme they were promised for their horrific treatments at the hands of the state. I began by asking when we became so cruel. Perhaps the honest answer is that we have never been anything but, and if nothing else, the state approach to migrants over the last few months has given a clearer understanding of how the other horrors of the state were permitted to happen for so long. Certainly, we remain very good at allowing others to monetise the suffering of the vulnerable, and my colleague Catherine Murphy has already demonstrated that aspect very well in her contribution. But Minister, let me ask you directly, where are the reception centres? We've had a back and forth about beds that were vacant or otherwise, but we're 24 months into this and I still haven't seen where the reception centres. There's a memo going to Cabinet next week, you said, and yet we're still, why is that 24 months in? In February 21, your course aware that Catherine Day published a white paper which recommended providing 6 state-run reception and integration centres very quickly for obvious reasons that you've already captured. That became outdated, but in July 2023, Catherine Day published an update for her 2021 paper and stated 6 reception centres should urgently be provided. Where are they? In her updated paper, Ms Day said 3 centres should be delivered by the end of 2023 and a further 3 by the end of 2024. None of these state-run reception and integration centres have yet been provided. There have been media reports that the government may defer identifying locations for these centres until after the local elections in June, and that's actually the exact wording is in the motion that the government is not voting against. I mean, for me, I can't understand if that's not the truth, why you wouldn't vote against it. However, Minister, allow me to tell you directly that if it's the case that state-operated reception centres are being politicised to the extent that they're being held back until after an election, that is in itself abhorrent, and I can think of no greater justification for any progressive person to walk away from a government if that is a tactic. And let me ask in the last minute that I have, who is it that we're afraid of? Who is it that has made us become so cruel when people who understand to have such a commitment to humanitarian advocacies have demonstrated a degree to turn away? Is it the people who are burning down these buildings and telling us to be scared of the people inside it? Is that who we're afraid of? Because I'm certainly not. In fact, the community that I represent in Dublin Central and North Inner City, they're not reflective of that either. When I knock at doors every single night, as I have been over the last couple of weeks and months, people are talking to me about the inhumanity that's been experienced with people. They're not telling us to be harsh in their treatment. There are those who wish to tell us to be scared of religious extremism that may be exported to our shores, and yet they still don't talk about a scenario where we have a church in this country who still have not paid reparations to their own victims. We understand religious extremism. We fought it. All of us have. And we do it again if necessary, but that is not the case, and I will not have people like scaremongering to that degree. There's the people that want to make us believe that those coming here will increase violence against women, for example, without even once acknowledging the fact that the most vulnerable place a woman can be in this home, the most likely place where they'd like to be killed is in our own home by a partner known to them. And they still want to tell us that we're bringing in people who are in danger. There is an agenda here to make scapegoats of people who come in here in search of sanctuary from bombs falling on them or from starvation. And I will not be complicit in the apologies of 2 decades' time. I think we all know what we stand for, the Republic that what we want to be involved in. And people in tents and tarpaulins is not reflective of that. So we, without apology, bring this motion to the Dáil tonight. If we have to do it again in 2 months' time, we absolutely will.
Agus inis ag bogar Sinn Féin agus I cheapta John Brady cúig nómé.
Firstly, I want to thank the Social Democrats for bringing the motion before us here this afternoon, which once again places the spotlight on the chaos and the adhocracy and utter failure of the government to address the crippling crisis, housing crisis within this state. The government's approach clearly is not working. It exposes a chaotic approach to immigration, which has failed communities and those coming to these shores seeking international protection. And the crux of the situation is that there is no government plan for immigration and providing accommodation. Minister, we need a rules-based system, one where the rules are actually implemented that is fair, efficient and enforced, with proper communication with communities. And the government approach has been shambolic, to say the least, from the outset and continues to be so up unto this day. There is no plan, no consistent approach, and you're not working with local communities. You're not bringing them with you. Minister, 1,300 international protection applicants were living in tents last weekend until they were scooped off the streets of the city centre and deposited in a field of mud on the side of the Dublin mountains in what can be only described as a cynical PR exercise by government to clear the streets ahead of St. Patrick's Day. And a further 13,000 plus people are homeless across the state. Minister, in this day and age, nobody in this state should be homeless. The living conditions that international protection applicants were forced to live in were absolutely inhumane. Unfortunately, those shipped out to the site of the former nursing home at Crooksling are experiencing similar levels of misery, to the point that a growing number believe that they are better off back on the streets of the city centre. And what we have seen from the government has been an absolute lack of coherence. They've bounced from crisis to crisis, failing to address any of the core issues underpinning the crisis, leading to a system that takes years to process applications with zero enforcement at the end of the day. Minister, if a decision is made to refuse an application, it's simply not being enforced at the end. And my party's policies in relation to housing are a matter of record and represent a pathway out of the current crisis for the thousands who have been imparted by the failure of successive governments. And Minister, we've consistently and vigorously argued the need for a fair, efficient and enforced immigration system with proper engagement with host communities, dealing with core issues of capacity of local services, which is lacking in communities right across the state. And ultimately, if an application is failed, it would be enforced in a timely manner, returning people safely to their country of origin. We also, Minister, need to speed up the process of processing of international protection applications. It's completely unacceptable that it's taken years upon years in some cases to process them. And this is absolutely overwhelming an already stretched system, creating huge bottlenecks in the provision of accommodation, leading to an absolute shambolic approach by government to the issue of immigration. And in my own constituency of Wicklow, Minister, we have a situation where the department are not only failing to communicate with the community there, they're also failing to communicate with local representatives. But you're actually appearing to actively deceive them in regard of your true intentions, because for years the community in Newtown, Minister, have campaigned for the former local HSC premises to be transferred to the community, and that is at Trudder House. And we've seen consistently over those years and repeatedly from the department that that premises is not fit for purpose, it's not fit for human use. And the Minister and the department continue to this day to insist that no decision has been taken regarding the use of that site by IPAS, but the reality is the opposite appears to be the case. And Minister, it has to be said, there's a clear attempt, in my view, to hoodwink the community and public representatives on the issue, because the reality on the ground is that locals are looking at bulldozers as we speak on the site, stripping back topsoil, putting down hardcore stone along with prefabs on the site. Is it any wonder, Minister, at the end of the day, that communities are up in arms? And I'll finish off on this last count, Corla. It needs to be said that the government's actions are actually fostering local anger and protests. And Minister, over the next couple of weeks here, the Green Party will facilitate a charade in terms of Fine Gael putting forward their leader, a new Taoiseach. But the reality here is, Minister, we need a general election. We need a general election so people can have a say on the crisis in housing, the crisis in the health service, and the absolutely shambolic and chaotic handling of the whole issue of immigration. Minister, we need a general election, and you need to not facilitate the anointment of a new Fine Gael Taoiseach. You need to ensure that there's a general election so that people can adjudicate on your failure and the failure of this government on all of these issues.
There are three speakers down here. I'm not sure if you have three, but there are three speakers.
We'll work what we have at the moment. So is Cúisnara doing mar náisiún go bhfuil daoine ar shráideann an príomhchathair atá na cónaí I pobal. Idir siúd atá gan déan agus siúd atá in san chóras na teifig le blianta roimhe seo. Bhí mid an fadaigh feiceant thar lear agus bhíoh mid a tarnigord na cathracha de pobal a bhíonn na Stáit Aontaithe Americaáins na cathracha an sin agus an tepper an céad down á lua going agus mid ag fechan ar pictúrí sin ach anois is pictúrí de shráid an bhóta atá daoine fechan ar timpeall an down áit atá an tep omláin ó thaobh an chóras na teifigin san tíir seo léirithe go hillas go thomláin I pictúrí agus tá sé dochrata go bhfuil matréis an staid sin a thrisint ag an staid seo. Tá an cearta an aire nuair a deir sé go bhfuil cearta déana a gceist agus go bhfuil go cordúing na Oireachtas ar chairman a chosint agus go bhfuil chóras ann, but an fáid bonúsachta ann anois na níl an chóras a gobar agus níl an stáit a gobar agus ag pleanáil a gceart. Bhíosca an aire, bhíosca an Ryan, bhíosca going istigin seo go raibh fáibanna ag tacht ach ní raibh an pleanáil déanta, ní raibh na saomhanna ann. In Janeán na buicin a bhí ag dó na saomhanna bhí is a ghain go raibh gá le bhadaí níos mó agus go raibh gá le gníomh níos mó chun denmh cinnte de siúd a lurgaín chairman an seo go raibh mid a tuairt agus tuairt meastáibh agus go raibh mid a cuidú láibh agus nach raibh mid a chur ar na sráidna mar a bhí agus mar a tábhad a denmh le siúd gan déad in san tír. Hanna féin ba cá go mbeadh I ngacha le bailach go mbeadh an chóras tróchrach agus den achtuil dóid siúd siúd gan déan siúd tá an seo ag glórug cosint agus ag glórug déan agus siúd atá an seo hana féin atá ag glórug tithe nó atá an choras ag glórug tithe agus gan déan. Agus is tap omláin an rialtas seo agus rialtas rive nach raibh an plánál i gceart agus ghuiilmid sa staidin na bhfuilmid. Ba bhfuil an deis a thógant cógádas gháil le gná muintir na hÉireann. I want to congratulate and thank the ordinary people of Ireland who have in fact stepped up to the mark and have reached out and tried to ensure that they have helped and have offered opportunities for those who are homeless in our society and those who are coming to Ireland seeking refuge, that they have welcomed them when the government has worked with them in communities. In any of the communities I represent, where the department has worked with them, there has been a welcome. There has been an approach by communities and an effort to ensure that those kind of, whether they're men, women or children, that there is a space for them. They've also reached out and said kind of that they need additional service. They need help in that work. Kind of, so it's not just a question about the sites for IPAs, and that's the scandal. But kind of we do need to look at the extra supports that is required by communities, whether it's GPs, whether it's helping the schools, and there have been steps made, but not enough, and that's why sometimes you get an anger. It's a misplaced anger. The anger should be directed at government for their failures, and there should never be an anger in any shape or form directed at those who come to Ireland seeking refuge, and those who are down on their luck, kind of in the same way that Irish people after the famine and even before that went to other countries around the world and sought refuge, sought a new life, sought to ensure that they could help those who living in poverty in Ireland come through that by sending money home. We need to look at our history and understand our history to make sure that kind of we learn from it and we protect those who come to our shores. We need to ensure that the IPA system works properly and is fair kind of for everyone, and that's not fair when you have people living on the streets of Dublin in tents in any shape or form. And I also want to support those who have already called out those bigots and the racists who are in our society, who have used this as an opportunity to mobilise and to attack those who are down on their luck. And I believe a lot more needs to be done to out them and to show them for what they are, bigots and racists. We have to challenge all of that, not just in Ireland but throughout Europe, kind of where there seems to be a rise in that right-wing sentiment. But as I said, our communities are great and they need the support and they need the service to ensure that they can mobilise and respect those who come to our shores.
Speaker coming after you.
What we saw in Mount Street last week was a visualisation of the stark failures of the government's immigration and asylum system. The government has failed. The Minister is clearly out of his depth. Communities are antagonised. Vulnerable people are left in atrocious, inhumane conditions. This shouldn't be complicated. What we need is an asylum system that is fair, efficient and enforced. Those fleeing conflict and persecution need this. Ireland needs this. Our communities demand this. The failure to enforce the current system has increased pressure for accommodation for those seeking asylum. It has left some people, like those in Mount Street, on the streets. It's currently, Laskin Corla, taken far too long to process applications for asylum. It has to change. If someone comes to Ireland seeking asylum, their application should be processed quickly, and there are no excuses in my view for it to take years. If they're entitled to asylum, they should be quickly given the necessary supports to enter the workforce and to help enriching our country, just as Irish people have done elsewhere for generations. It's clear, though, that the government must speed up the processing of international protection applicants who are coming from so-called safe countries. They must ensure full and final decisions are made as fast as possible so that we have a system whereby it works. And for all applicants, if they're not entitled to asylum, the requirement to leave must be enforced. The reliance on the private sector, that small cohort of individuals and companies that are making huge profits from the system, is a scandal, and communities are paying the price. That reliance on the private sector means communities are not consulted, they are losing key local facilities and amenities and are getting angry as a result. Minister, you have to work with people. You have to listen to people. You can't ride roughshod over communities, many of whom have for too long been left behind. I'm talking in my instances about small rural towns who have been for decades crying out for investment and services. I've also seen in many of those rural towns and villages where refugee accommodation programmes have worked very well. In all of those cases, it was because there was communication, there was engagement, and there were planning with local communities, planning around education, planning around health, planning for integration. But what we are now seeing is day in and day out the consequences of the government's shambolic approach and failure to plan. The housing crisis, the lack of GPs, the lack of dentists, the lack of Gardaí, none of these issues are dealt with. Communities are under pressure, and they're putting under even more pressure, and they feel that no one is listening. No one, it seems, in government understands the difficulties they are facing. Communities who have welcomed those seeking international protection have not got the investment that they were promised. So we have to deal with this in a way that is fair, efficient and enforced, as my colleague has said. And Sinn Féin believes that state-provided accommodation should be properly located, resourced and serviced. And the government must start planning to return hotels and other buildings to their original purposes so as to restore local tourism-based economies and vital services for communities. To deal with the migration crisis, we also have to deal with the factors that are pushing people from their home countries. We need to work for an end of conflicts that are creating devastation and driving migration. In Ukraine, in the Middle East and in Africa, you cannot support, as some members of this House do, warmongering and militarisation on the one hand and then be surprised when it leads to further flows of displaced people on the other hand. When the government signed up to the Temporary Protection Directive in respect of Ukraine, Ireland became an outlier in terms of the conditions that were offered. Some Fianna Fáil representatives at the time suggested that we may have up to 200,000 arrivals from Ukraine. And at the time, Sinn Féin raised serious concerns about the government's lack of consideration as to the capacity to deal with such large numbers. We had about half of those numbers and the entire system has collapsed. Those temporary measures expire next year. Government must now plan for that and signal that our immigration laws will apply across the board. That means that those here from Ukraine will need to either get a work visa or apply for international protection in the same way as all others who are fleeing war. This mess has gone on too long. I have to say, Minister, if you take the smirk off your face, it is unacceptable that you made an entire speech without acknowledging a single failure on your part or on the part of your department. The government has to get its act together because we cannot go on any longer operating a system that is neither fair, efficient nor enforced, because the longer you continue to operate as you have been with your head in the sand, the longer this crisis will go on and the further detached local communities will get from this process.
Minister, I suppose I was out canvassing during the week and I knocked at the door and I met this gentleman that I know him for years and I know his families for years. And what he said to me, Minister, is that you and your government are making him a racist. This man was never a racist. He was a hard-working man who raised a good family. He never had an issue with refugees or asylum seekers. He is an adult child who has a disability and he's had to fight all his life for services for his child. Unfortunately, tragically, his wife had 2 strokes last year and she can't get a medical card. And he is really angry because he's saying to me he's had to fight all his life for his child. Now he has to fight for his wife Where is the fairness? And the thing about it is, like, he never had a problem with asylum seekers or refugees. But people are pitting one vulnerable group against another. The anger should be at this government and your policies, and not giving his wife a medical card, not giving his child the services that she should always had. And the thing about it, his son came home from Australia to see his mother because she's sick. And I was talking to him, he said, I'm going back to Australia. He said, Tommy, there's nothing for me here. He said, I'm over there, I'm valued, I have a house, I have a roof over my head, and I have a good standard of living. What am I doing? Coming back to Granabraha, where I'm from, to live in his mother's box room at 30 years of age. Because that's what your government have done. And another lady says to me, and this is what people are seeing on the ground, she also feels she's becoming racist. Because she has applied for a medical card, she's currently undergoing treatment for cancer, she can't get a medical card. And she said, Tommy, they're getting off the planes in Dublin and they're giving them medical cards. And I said to Claire, that's not their fault. That's this government's fault for not giving people, everyone who has cancer, entitlement to a medical card. So it's your policies. And what's happening is you're driving a wedge between communities. That's what's happening. Like, Minister, I think you have to take responsibility. You have to admit you made mistakes. I've spoken to you here about different centres. I'll work with you. And just to let you know, there was a big announcement last week, and I have a lot of things I wanted to say, Minister. The Gerald Griffiths Centre in Cork, a big announcement last week. But at this moment, there's people who are fleeing, who are seeking asylum, living there, who've been there, who their children are going to local schools, and they're working locally. And now they're being put out for new people to come in. And I'll finish with this. All you're doing is you're massaging the figures, trying to turn vulnerable people against each other, and it's wrong.
I really don't know what to say now after those contributions from Sinn Féin. I really don't, and I'm disappointed that I have to say this, because I sat through contributions a couple of weeks ago in relation to arson attacks, and I really expected better from Sinn Féin. And I remember one contribution which didn't mention arson at all. It was all about the immigration system and consultation and all the rest of it. And many of the contributions from Sinn Féin there were laudable and said the right thing and things I'd absolutely agree with. And there's members of Sinn Féin in my own constituency who are doing the hard work to fight back against extremism and racism and bigotry. But I have to say, some of those contributions there today, I really do wonder. I really do wonder where Sinn Féin are going, why they're running to the right, why they're pitting vulnerable people against each other, and also, It's remarkable how you try to make a constructive comment about other people's presentations here, but it's quite clear as to why. It's quite clear. It's quite clear. It's quite clear as to what. Well, I have to be honest in my contribution about what is happening here, and I did notice when Sinn Féin marched in behind the government and voted to cut social welfare payments for Ukrainian refugees. I remember that. I noticed it, and I was wondering what was going on, and now it makes sense to me. It makes sense to me. Because the protesters are winning. The roadblockers are winning. The arsonists are winning. Because Sinn Féin are going to the right on immigration. It's working. It's working. It's working. Now, what I would say this, Minister, I was in a position like yours 10 years ago. I didn't have to deal with what you have to deal with now. I didn't have to deal with the issues that you had to deal with currently. We didn't have the numbers. We didn't have racists in the Dáil in the same number as you have to deal with, or in the Shannon. But I did have a partner in government who was unsympathetic, which is what you have. And I also had to deal with, I have to say this, a permanent government which are institutionally racist. And what I used to hear when I was in the department at the time, not the same department as yours, but the department that was dealing with this issue, was pull factor, pull factor, pull factor, pull factor. And I do actually feel as if there is a percentage thought within the permanent government that wants to see images of people in tents in Mount Street, because it suits the agenda. Don't come here. Don't come here. And Minister, I always think in politics you're either part of the solution or part of the problem. And I don't think that you are part of the problem. I think you're part of the solution. And I think, you know, you came into government with a fair-minded view of direct provision to get rid of it, to nationalise it as it was, not to be dependent on the private sector. And I applaud you for that vision. And I think if it wasn't for the Ukrainian crisis, you would have delivered on it by now. And I can absolutely accept that all these things you have to deal with are difficult. You are getting zero support from your partners in government. That's clear. That's been outlined as well by my colleagues in the Social Democrats, who I should have originally thanked for putting down this motion, which says a lot about their ethics and their value system. So, you know, this is the sort of imagery that they want to have. What I would have thought would have worked 2 weeks ago with Mount Street Minister, if you yourself or, you know, a high-ranking official in your department had gone down to Mount Street and given that leadership and say, no, this just isn't acceptable, and spoken to the incredible local community organisers, most of whom are women, local women, who totally put to bed this idea that women need to be afraid of asylum seekers, who came in down to the street, engaged with them. I've witnessed it myself, handing over shoes, handing over clothes, handing over food, or organising a rota of care. Then we also had medics down there looking after them. We had, you know, people advocating for them, speaking about the spread of disease, scabies, etc. And the men themselves, some of whom were minors, were very appreciative of the efforts. But then you couldn't help, Minister, that Saturday to be pretty taken aback by how dramatic it was. How dramatic it was that a bus rolls up, or a number of buses roll up. They're sent somewhere that they don't know where they're going, and then Dublin City Council come in, having previously slashed the tents individually, then collecting with a big picker. I was talking to one man who just got an email from the IPO saying that there was accommodation organised for himself in Dundrum. He didn't know where Dundrum was. And I accompanied him over to the office. Now, by the way, the women themselves locally had paid for some taxis to go from some of the men to Dundrum because accommodation had been organised for them. And I went in with him to the IPO office, and I asked him, how is this man supposed to get to Dundrum? And they had no answer for me. They pointed to where the Lewis stop was, they pointed to where the bus stop was. This man had no English, he was completely disorientated. He was clearly in a vulnerable situation. He had to try to trust me. So we gave him cash, we put him in a taxi. The taxi man was very, very sympathetic, and off he went to Dundrum. But I just thought there was some basic lack there of humanity within the system to facilitate that man to get to where the email had told me he had to go. And I think Deputy Whitmore said it very eloquently, that I think we've forgotten that these are human beings. We've forgotten that they're human beings. We've forgotten the humanity in their eyes. We are consistently dealing with them as statistics or, numbers that we just have to get down. And it is as a direct result of government policy that was, initiated last December. And it's going to get worse because the clock is already ticking on the 90 days that Ukrainian refugees have, new arrivals, in our system, accommodation for them. After 90 days, are we not pretty sure that we're going to have Ukrainians in around Mount Street or other parts of the city or the country under the same conditions? So, Minister, I think you know all this. We have never had a time in Ireland when elections were determined by immigration, where debates in here were about immigration, where people played the race card. But it's happening now. The only time it ever happened was 20 years ago, the first time I ran for a local election, when there was a citizenship referendum at the time. And it was a 78% vote for people in favour of restricting citizenship rights for Irish-born children. I didn't think we go back there again. And the fact that we're back here again is not your fault, because I know you're trying to do the right thing. But we have to have a basic level of humanity in how we deal with these things. And as things were done, and I'll finish on this account, Corda, the way things were organised last Saturday just speaks to a basic lack of respect. That there wasn't even that simple compassion of information and care for those individuals as to where they were going to next, explaining as to where they were going, what the facilities will be like, and how the process is going to benefit them and empower them. I believe we can do better, Minister, but I believe you need more support. Other government departments are not stepping up. The Department of Defence isn't stepping up, the Department of Education isn't stepping up, and absolutely the Department of Housing is not stepping up. But I think all parties in this House need to be part of the solution and not vastly becoming part of the problem.
Thank you, Deputy O'Riordan. Deputy Kenny now sharing with Deputy Smith.
Count Carla. Minister, I think you will agree that nobody should be homeless, regardless of where you're from. That could be Dublin, Cork, Belfast or Galway. Nobody should be homeless in this day and age. And I think we can all agree that for decades there's been a policy of free market ideology that has normalised homelessness, has put people, on the street or people without shelter. And at this moment in time, there's 14,000 people. Some are Irish, some are not from Ireland and so forth, in emergency accommodation. And that is a pretty scandalous situation. Over 4,000 children in emergency accommodation. It's quite incredible. And the composition of those that are homeless obviously has changed from individuals to now families. But the treatment of people, and they are people, they're human beings like me and you, last weekend was absolutely unacceptable. Unacceptable that people that come to this country that seek support are treated like that. And I'm sure, Minister, you don't support that. I'm sure you don't. You're a decent person, a very decent person. But surely you could not support the way them people were treated last weekend. And the majority of people in Ireland are very, very, very decent people. We understand immigration, and we understand it's quite incredulous that we have empty buildings that are state-owned that people can use. They could be used even in an emergency situation, regardless of where you come from. Surely people deserve some sort of shelter, and yet, this state is not doing that. And you have to ask yourself, why is it not doing that? It is obviously to send a signal to others to say, look, do not come here, because if you do, this is what's going to happen. And Minister, there is other individuals in this state that are trying to pit others against people that are trying to do their best, even around homelessness. And there are people trying to stir up all sorts of kind of divisions and hatred in our own communities in regards to, well, why did they not look after their own? And what I say to people, if I'm out canvassing, if somebody says, why can we not look for their own? But the state has never looked after their own. There's a reason why people are homeless in the first place, because it's of policy, and policy of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. Particularly the last 20 years, why people find themselves without a home, without a shelter. And then that kind of stems down to people that just literally have nowhere to go. So, we're talking about the most basic of human rights, the most basic. And if we can't offer people even the basics of shelter, there's something fundamentally wrong with this government.
Margaret, just on the same theme, I was out earlier on with Martin Leahy, who comes up from Cork every Thursday to sing his song, Everyone Should Have a Home, outside the Dáil. And just so people know, on the 18th of April, it'll be his 100th week after we return from the Easter break. And I think all of us who are concerned with homelessness and with the crisis of immigration and the homelessness among immigrants, we should be outside to sing that song with Martin on the 18th of April as a form of protest. And I want to really stay on the question of empty state properties. I've been in touch with your Minister. I thought we should have a whole separate session on what happened last Saturday. And like Deputy O'Riordan, I was at the IPAS Centre and saw the removal of the tents and the properties of immigrants by the private company that was hired by the council. Same company, by the way, which I witnessed moving traveller accommodation from Labra Park, where Senator Eileen Flynn comes from, a number of years ago. It seems to be when there's issues to do with the presence of illegality of people who have nowhere else to go, there seems to be a solution to get a big mechanical grabber and just remove them. In the 21st century, it seems to me to be utterly shameful. My big thing about you moving people out of Crooksling, of course, was not so much just the scrapping of the tents as Crooksling itself. I know it because I used to work there years ago. Being a site on the road from Tallaght to Blessington was the site of an arson attack, precisely because immigrants were supposed to be moved out there. And I just thought, like, you'd want to be nuts to send them back to where the scene of the crime was. And of course, they did face protests and hostility and threats, and probably will do again. And I would like some guarantee from your office that they will be protected and be safe there. But on the question of empty properties, what does emerge when you look into this is that the HSE, which you could clarify for us, did own, or now the state owns, and please help us when you distinguish between state-owned property and HSE-owned property. Surely the HSE is an arm of the state, and therefore whatever property it owns is state-owned property. Because when it comes to the question of arguing for Bagot Street Hospital, which could, according to Mel Reynolds, the architect, with very little expenditure on it, house up to 600 people, because you've got corridors, dormitories, toilets and showers and kitchens and all. Sorry? Well, that's not what the report says. That is not what any report says. That's brand new to us, that there's asbestos in it. Because up to now, all we've been told is that the state doesn't own it. It is owned by the HSE. The HSE, it transpired, are the biggest land hoarders in the state, with over 300 empty properties. Some of them I know of in my own constituency. And the problem here is that those who have been described here as being racist and those who are trying to stir up trouble, they certainly do. I see their bile and their hatred all the time on social media, but their argument is that Ireland is full, and so therefore we can't take in any more refugees, and the opposite couldn't be truer. Ireland is no way full, and it isn't particularly not full because of the empty properties and empty houses that are lying throughout the state. So with the 164,000 empty houses throughout the state, if you calculate that down, where there's 2,000 families in emergency accommodation, of which 57% are single parent families, for every one family there are 65 empty houses. For every one man, woman or child who are in homeless accommodation, there are 12 empty properties across the state. Now, when you do those figures, it's absolutely shocking. And when you look at the level of state-owned properties that lie empty, it means, first of all, there should not be a housing crisis for any man, woman and child. There shouldn't be 4,000 homeless children growing up in emergency accommodation. There shouldn't be 14,000 people in emergency accommodation. And there should be nobody sleeping on the side of the road in tents. I mean, nobody. I don't care where they're from, but certainly not immigrants and people who come in big numbers and look for our protection. They need to be helped and protected. And the empty buildings are there, the resources are there. You say it yourself in your own speech, where you're going to announce something next week which says we're going to look after a new project that's going to take state-owned properties and make sure there's enough accommodation. I'm dying to hear that announcement, and you're hopeful that it can be achieved in a few months, when already about 4 years ago, Eamon Ryan made statements saying that empty properties would be freed up, and they haven't been. There is a problem with the way you're dealing with this, and acknowledge it and help us to deal with the fact that hatred is rising in communities against people who are brown and black because of the filth and the lies that is spread about them.
Deputy Matt Shanahan, please.
Armagh Count Corla. I want to firstly thank the Social Democrats and particularly Jennifer Whitmore for tabling this motion today. One of the first words within the Social Democrats' motion, Minister, is humanitarian. And I think it's very important that we remember that that is at the centre of whatever policy we are trying to enact here. Your government responses and the actions, I would say to you, frame not just our national attitude to potential immigration in this country, but it also aligns and underlines our competency or not of our state services to adequately manage and discharge the responsibilities we have given them. I think it's shameful that Ireland, a country where immigration has been so endemic, that is so much part of our make-up, that we are in the position that we are presently in. Indeed, on Taoiseach, as he was, gently excoriated his host in Washington last week, trading on the moral authority of Ireland's experience of migration to, as forcefully as possible, on the occasion permitted, make the case to America to use its moral authority to stop the continuing horrors in Gaza. This motion calls on government to publish an audit of its international accommodation protection services, identifying where vacant beds are available and if and how they are being used. Surely that information is available to you, widely available to you, Minister, I would have thought, in Department. So why is it the case that you have not been able to share that to date in the House? I am old enough to remember when the Green Party promised to end direct provision. And at the time, good-thinking people felt it was a blight on our national reputation. And now it has suddenly become our national saviour in this situation. It's a marked improvement for sure from busing people from Mount Street to the boonies, hidden away for just one day while we celebrated our national identity around the world. Out of sight, out of mind is not a policy the people of this country want government to pursue, Minister. I think government has continued to rely on the big problem, low competency defence that is endemic at present in our handling of housing, healthcare, our technological universities, transport, and the list goes on. And I know, and I've spoken to many Irish people who feel they are being let down by our shoddy rate, second-rate infrastructure and services, and by implication, our instinct to offer a big warm welcome for those under the present spotlight. You've announced a position previously, Minister, to set up 6 national centres to manage IP applicants. Why the delay in getting this done? And I think you've said you'll get 3 done this year and 3 done next year. That surely doesn't sound like an emergency response. And I think that we have to look at, how we are doing this and how it's affecting not alone our reputation, but how it is creating, unfortunately, pushback from around the country. Since we were children, Minister, we were all taught to look before you leap. And it's clear from the sight of approximately 150 tents being placed around Mount Street and the condition that those people found themselves in, that government has shown a serious lack of understanding and process management. Every time I have spoken about this humanitarian crisis, and that's exactly what it is, I have said that we should have a pragmatic approach to taking in asylum seekers and accommodating them appropriately, and ensuring those given leave to stay have significant opportunities presented to allow them to integrate fully into Irish society. I'm not sure that's happening, Minister. And I can tell you what isn't working, Minister, and well you know it. Placing people into rural locations with little or no access to public services instead is not solving a problem, but it is in fact creating ones. And doing private procurement deals of the last available tourist beds in our regional towns and villages is not solving a problem either, but creating one. Those trying to access Ireland under the International Protection Programme should not be placed in competition with the resident population who are looking also for access to accommodation and services, but this has clearly been a feature of the present rollout. We are squeezing the economic potential out of some of our regional towns, our tourism offerings, with this ad hoc accommodation policy, Minister, and inevitably we are stoking up and provoking people who have done so much to try and help in this crisis. So I think, Minister, you need to give serious time and capital consideration to providing centres. I'd also ask the question, I think we do need a new strategy around this, and I heard your earlier statement saying you're going to announce something new next week, and we'll all await to see what that is. But I would ask you, Minister, one simple thing we could do is expand the safe country list. And why are we not reflecting the safe country list of our EU partners? That's the first thing I think we should do. And the second thing is I think we need to look at the opportunities for people to integrate in this country, because I think we've seen it in cities and towns across Europe and throughout the world. If you bring people in and if you crowd them into one area, particularly people of the same population the same language, if you don't give them pathways to integrate, if we don't allow them some opportunity to quickly coalesce with the local population, we end up then with this multicultural, not mixing society. That is not what we want. The Irish people are welcoming people. They want to remain welcoming. And certainly I can say in my own county of Waterford, we have a number of centres and we have a number of populations who have integrated really well. And it's very heartening when you go to the sideline of GAA matches and you see the multicultural integration that is taking place. That's what we want to deliver, but we have to do it with respect, Minister. We need a system that works, and for those who are given leave to stay, we need to integrate, and for those who are not given leave to stay, we need to find them back to the places where they came from.
Thank you, Deputy Shanahan. Deputy Carl Nolan is now sharing with Deputies McGrath, Collins and O'Donoghue.
Minister, there are some of us in this chamber who could rightfully stand up and say, I told you so. I told your government, and indeed your colleague Minister Darragh O'Brien, in this stall 22 months ago, that we were heading towards a totally unsustainable and chaotic social catastrophe, and here we are. That would bring about more than human misery than we could possibly deal with, and as a small country. But did the ministers or government listen? No. Were those of us who asked for completely reasonable things like impact assessments ridiculed and condemned as bigots and racists? Yes, we were. And just look at where we are today. An immigration system and an immigrant homeless situation that is nothing short of spiralling social sabotage. This government has no answers for one simple reason, and that is that it does not ask the right questions and it does not listen. There's huge disconnect. Our tourism industry is destroyed, beyond repair, destroyed, even though millions were pumped into that industry. There's towns like Drogheda with no hotel, there's Roscrea with no hotel, and that's thanks to your reckless policy. Instead of asking how many we can take in or how many we can absorb when we're already confronted by a housing emergency, this government, cheered on by the left, all of the opposition, who failed to stand up and ask the questions apart from the independents, who are here today weeping crocodile tears and trying to appease the electorate. They never asked how, to stop, or asked for you to assess and ask you to stop the reckless approach that you were adopting. 22 months ago, I asked the Minister if he was saying that we welcome everybody in, the whole world in, only to leave them sleeping on hotel floors. It's now worse. They're sleeping on streets. And it's pointless here today unless you're going to put a robust immigration policy in place. We cannot have the reckless situation we have and the hard left crying and adopting a very naive and gullible approach, a reckless approach to our economy, to our society and to our safety as well, because we have unvetted immigrants coming in. You'd need to cop yourselves on. Cop yourselves on. Cop yourselves on. They're the facts. They're the facts. You mightn't like them, but they're the facts. The hard left again. Here we go, jumping up and down. Jumping up and down. You're reckless, naive and gullible. I'll take no lectures from you. I'll take no lectures from you, Deputy Oireachtas, who actually said in 2014 that there were limitations. I'll take no lectures from you. I'll take no lectures from you or your Communist Party. None whatsoever. None. And I'm going to now end. Tough if you don't like it. You'll hear it from your constituents anyway. Tough.
We take no lectures.
I take no lectures from a communist.
In the advance of Holy Week, we take no lectures from the hard left and the loony left over here who won't face the people. Minister, look, this is a shambles, and I lay it at your door, and I know that your colleague, Minister O'Brien, has engaged with me on many occasions. To think that the people of Roscrea today, 10 weeks today, that when their hotel was taken over and when the Gardaí was sent down to do terrorise the people of Roscrea, good, decent people, I repeat, ordinary mothers and fathers, or grandmothers and parents and children, that had no objection to children. They wanted their hotel, and the whole thing was manipulated and supported and cheerleaded by the loony lefts, as I call them here. You got your answer in the referendum. The people are sick, sore and tired of you. Our own young people have to go abroad. 13,500 on our own housing list. And what happened in Mount Street is just a disgrace. Minister, you decided to go to Japan. Well, I suppose Timbuktu would be a fan of at this stage if we went and stayed there. Japan, and saw that happen there. And unfortunately, people then brought him out to the Dublin Mountains in tents and took away, hired machinery to take away their tents here. What kind of Christianity was that? The problem is you won't stop the numbers coming in, because you sent out tweets to welcome them all from God knows where. The numbers on St. Patrick's Day, Lord Fail Party, our national patron saint, and the numbers that they reached, if I can find them here, they reached record level of asylum seekers in this country on that day, and still going. And the PR stunt in that you had, what you're doing in Brown Street, brought him out there. Minister, will you please engage with people? You haven't gone down to Roscrea to meet the people. You haven't gone to Fermoy to meet the people. You haven't gone anywhere to meet the people. But you can't hide from the electorate. And neither can Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin, Labour, Social Democrats, the whole lot of you. And you got your answer last week, they're waiting in the long grass for you because they're 6 or 30, because you have a dislike of the Irish people. And you seem to have a hatred for the Irish people who elect you in here and who pay your wages, the taxpayers. But they're waiting for you. You have that, and they're waiting for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, excuse me, I'm speaking.
Absolute
We never interrupted you when you were speaking.
What do you mean by
You were
that? You're
raising
waiting
neck over
in the long
there.
grass for us.
Count Corla, is it possible to speak here in the Dáil or
And
not?
it's migrant men you say
Or
we
is
should
it
be
you
afraid
want to
of?
dictate what happens in the
Shame to
Dáil?
yourselves.
You know nothing about shame, because you're not in touch with your electorate, and yeah, that's one thing sure. This Social Democrats motion has brought to light the pressing issue of asylum seekers in Ireland. However, the motion seems to be rooted in a utopian vision where The motion seems to be rooted in a utopian vision where Ireland has an infinite capacity for accommodation and can continue to absorb the world's suffering by accepting an unlimited number of asylum seekers. It's totally nuts to think we can keep bringing people here to Ireland. Reality paints a different picture. Ireland has reached its capacity limit. We no longer have enough accommodation for asylum seekers, let alone our own citizens. The blame lies not only with the government, but also with parties like Labour, Sinn Féin and Social Democrats. These parties are all proponents of open borders, must share some responsibility for the current situation. It is simply inhumane to continue allowing asylum seekers into a country when the only option is to hand them a tent, while at the same time we have a record levels of homeless people living in Irish streets. Similar to the recent referendum we had, 70 to 75% of Irish people agree with my stance. As we see again, most parties in this Dáil are completely out of touch with what the electorate are saying. And before people start calling me racist and far right and all that kind of stuff, living in a tent on a street in a foreign country is not a way to treat people fleeing other countries. However, we do not have the capabilities to look after more and more refugees. It's time, and has been for a long time, to slow the flow.
Thank you. John Corla. I'm going to speak to facts. During the week, last week, we got an email from the local authority to say that there was a premises sold in Galbally, a 4,000 square foot building in Galbally, and Thomond House. Nobody in the community was contacted, but they told the local authority to send an email to us. Lack of services there. There are 31 people that want to move into 4,500 square feet. Now, I've been involved in housing people from Ukraine in this country. Women and children and vulnerable. Okay? So I've been involved in that. But can you let me speak, or have you got the ignorance to shut your mouth for 2 minutes, please? And what we've... Can you... Every time we speak at the moment now, they're cutting across us.
If the deputy has something to declare, he'll declare it. If he doesn't...
Are you going to let someone speak, or are you going to speak across everyone at the moment? I have nothing to declare, but I have helped women and children from Ukraine into areas in Limerick to put a roof over there. But I also looked to protect them and gave them the space within the area to make sure they can develop and be involved in our community.
All right.
By putting 200 people...
Deputy.
Sorry, Chair, they've cut across my time the whole time. I've only got 30 seconds to talk, and you've allowed 3 minutes from the Looney Tunes over in this corner to cut across us. No, I'm sorry. With all due respect, right, the last person was in a stretcher.
Can we have a little bit of mutual respect?
Thank you. I would appreciate that, and a given time to speak.
Now, from the point of facts, putting 31 people into a 4,000 square foot building where there is no access for complete services to get them in and out of there for themselves. Also putting 251 people into a school where there was no facilities for them. Okay, this is what we're looking at. Okay, and I'm going to finish on this. And again, this Looney Tunes over here are still talking.
Stop calling.
Well, they are, because they keep interrupting, because we're talking facts here. And if you look at this from a point of view, is Ireland are not saying they don't want to protect the people of Ireland, people of Ukraine. Yes, we do, but we want to give them a quality of life, not put them in tents, not bringing everyone in here where there's no services, and you want our own Irish people to sleep on the ground. That's what I'm talking about. If you let people explain.
Hold on. We've enough of this.
Thank you, Chair.
Resume your seat.
Can
we please respect each other? Please. Now, please. Name calling doesn't do anything for anybody.
Can I speak the facts, Chair?
Yeah, well, it does. It's not appropriate. It's not in order. Now, can we hear some reasoned comments from Deputy Catherine Connolly and Deputy Joan Collins, please?
I'm sickened to my core at the divisive nature of what's just taken place in this stall. I want to thank the Social Democrats for bringing this motion, and I'd like to place a little context on it. I've less than 4 minutes, so I'll do my best. 2 days after we celebrated our national identity, nationally and internationally, 1,323 people on the 19th of March were on the streets of Dublin in tents. They were moved from Mount Street to another venue that was the subject of an arson attack on the site adjacent to it. People seeking asylum are the most vulnerable people in society. They're fleeing war and persecution. It's extremely important to use these words because that's what asylum seekers are. And in the majority of cases, they've made treacherous, lengthy journeys at huge personal costs. 29,250 people have died or gone missing in the Mediterranean since 2014. Last year alone, 3,129 died or went missing. Internationally, 110 million people have been displaced. 43.3 million were children. And of those, 36.4 million were refugees. And I'd like to make a few comments now, having given those figures in the minute and a half I've left. The two ministers sit here today totally on their own. Catherine Day produced a report back in September 2020 that said there was an urgent need for a cross-government approach. They pointed out, as has been pointed out by previous reports, that the direct provision was inhuman and not fit for purpose. 24 years later, we're still left with it. Yes, of course, we had over 100,000 people fleeing from the war in the Ukraine. But that's not the reason why the government failed to do something. They failed to implement their own white paper. You failed to implement Catherine Day's recommendations, and you utterly failed to implement all of the very modest recommendations from the McMahon report. And we sit here today with this type of divisive debate, which is absolutely beneath all of us, when really we're talking about a finite number of people. I think in 28,181 is the finite number we're talking about them, and almost 6,000 of those have refugee status. If this rich country can't cope with that finite number of people seeking asylum in this country, then I give up. In relation to the war in the Ukraine, we've utterly failed to use our voices for peace. We have been part of the warmongering and part of the government constantly eroding our neutrality. Of course, we will not, as a small country, be able to accept every single asylum seeker. That's not what this is about. It's about enforcing and complying with our legal obligations, while at the same time using our independence, our sovereignty and our neutrality for a voice for peace in the world and not for warmongering.
Thanks very much, Cian Corla. First of all, I'd like to thank the Soc Dems for bringing this motion into the Chamber. I think it's a very worthy motion and worthy of a good debate in relation to where we are at the moment. We're watching your government, Minister, stand over a rapidly worsening crisis in accommodation for international protection applicants and Irish people. The government is time and time again, you've missed targets it has set for itself. This is becoming a national disgrace. We're failing to meet the international commitments we have in asylum seekers. We're failing to meet the basic moral obligation we have to care for people living in this country. Last week we witnessed your government make the decision to tear down a camp of asylum seekers and ship them out to an isolated area without the proper provision put in place at that time. At that time, there wasn't the proper facilities in place. That camp on Mount Street existed because of the failure of the state to provide appropriate accommodation, and the camp in Crooks Lane has quickly become another a failure of the state to provide appropriate accommodation. Tents is not an appropriate accommodation, and you know that, Minister. And I know you want to try and resolve it, but we haven't resolved it up to now, and we've been looking at this situation for the last 2 years. Now people are returning to Mount Street with tents, with more people arriving. Now we have created 2 humanitarian crises where there was one. That is endemic of in this government. You multiply the problems every time you fail to deal with the real problems. I just want to thank the local community for supporting people on Mount Street since December, and the medics, etc., who helped. This shows a strong similarity of how our state treats the record number of existing people in homelessness. We know that over 14,000 now. This is a long-term crisis. Long-time homeless activist Dermot MacDouglas described it as this. This has sadly been a feature of Dublin homeless life for many years now, where we've seen Irish homeless moved on for purely cosmetic reasons, such as celebrations, and notably during the visit of the US President last year, out of sight, out of mind, but no long-term solution. Now we're going to be looking at a crisis on the Ukrainian front with the 90 days state accommodation. And we don't have a crystal ball what's going to happen there, but I'm sure it's not going to be good. There's no long-term solution, and this is what characterises almost everything this government has done. The reason for this, in my opinion, is that we do not have the state capacity, because government and successive governments led by parties before you represent wealth and profit, and that means you won't tax wealth and profit at the rate we need to have a functioning state. We are a privately rich country, but publicly poor. This is a political decision made by Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, Greens, Labour over the last 5 decades to tax wealth at a rate that shrunk our state while we had a growing population. We need to increase our state capacity if we have any chance of solving the issues we face, or we will continue to have failed governments with no long-term plan who cannot fix the many crises we face in this country today. And we'll see more divisive debates like this in the Chamber over the period of time if we do not solve that issue. Because we're either going to we've got a situation where you're going to turn to the right and putting up borders, or we invest in our public services to facilitate everybody in this country that's coming in and massively supply that. And now you want us to accept a new Taoiseach, elected by the people, from a party that came third in the last election, selected by a handful of Fine Gael TDs and Senator. Michael Martin and Eamon Ryan might be happy for a handful of Fine Gael TDs to decide who our next Taoiseach will be, but the rest of the country, and a lot of the rest of the country, think the electorate should decide who leads this country. I think you've lost your mandate, you've lost your Taoiseach, and we need an immediate general election. I will finish on this. Asylum seekers and refugees seeking international protection coming into this country are not causing the crisis in housing and public services. Asylum seekers and refugees coming into this country are being caught up, like everyone else, in a crisis in housing and public services caused by successive governments that are ideologically opposed to taxing wealth at the rate we need to have a state that can function, because you represent the needs of profit and wealth and not of ordinary people. This is a failed government. I don't blame you, Minister Gorman. It is a whole of government failure. You've lost your mandate. You're playing political musical chairs where the country falls apart. This government needs to go. We need an election now.
Just before I call the Minister, we've had, I think, maybe unnecessarily acrimonious debate over the last while, because I can only say this. I grew up in a country that was practically monocultural and practically mono-ethnic. I'm glad that my adult children have grown to adulthood in a country that is multi-ethnic. I believe that the Ireland that we live in today is enriched by the people who have come here through the visa system and that have come here seeking a better standard of living for themselves and their families, as Irish people did in so many other parts of the world. I believe passionately that we're seeing a phenomenon that will continue and grow of migration from the developing countries to the developed world, where we need people to work, in our health services and right across the whole economy. And it behoves us as politicians, all of us, to find a way to work together to build consensus and support for that, not to build division and resentment. And it behoves government to support you, Minister, in a whole-of-government approach so that you can achieve the objectives that we all know you have. Minister O'Brien.
Thank you, Count Corley, for your intervention and your comments. Since January, approximately 2,400 beds have been brought into use for those seeking accommodation by the International Protection Accommodation Service. That said, week in, week out, we are opening new accommodation centres in communities across the country, and thankfully, by and large, they go unremarked upon because, for the most part, local communities have welcomed these new arrivals, and people are getting on with their lives, including those people trying to build a new life in a new country with all the hardship that entails. Since January 2022, the Department has brought over 200 additional properties into use to accommodate those who arrive in Ireland seeking international protection. And Department officials, and I do want to pay credit to Department officials here, they're invisible and they're criticised quite a lot, but they are working constantly to try and bring more bed spaces into use. And the evidence is there in that regard. So for context, at the end of January 2022, IPAS had 8,300 bed spaces in use. It now has approximately 28,000 beds in use. And that was at a time when there was a very large demand for BOTP beds at the time as well. Initial offers of accommodation are received by the International Protection Procurement Service, primarily through its email portal, ipps.quality.gov.ie. And once an offer is received, the IPPS sends a proposal template to the prospective provider that they are required to complete and return. Just wanted to put that out there just in terms of how we do it and how we need people to contact us. As with most things these days, especially those related to immigration and the international protection system, misinformation and fabrication is rife. And I would urge all members in these houses, both houses and the wider public, to be cognizant of that proliferation of misinformation and to desist from feeding it, indeed desist from creating it and developing it as well. And please desist from trying to stir anger in communities where you really don't need to do so. Just want to pick up on an issue that that was raised, or some concerns about the unaccommodated people. Just to clarify, and I think most people know this, drop-in day services are provided to all non-accommodated persons who wish to avail of them. In such centres, international protection applicants can access facilities including hot showers, meals and laundry services 7 days a week. Not good enough, I know, but I just want those facts to be out there. I think it's important to note that here that unfortunately some of the awful scenes of protest and criminal damage that we have seen in a small number of areas has negatively impacted on our ability to secure IP beds. And I would ask people, especially again deputies in this House, to reflect on that. Just a piece of information from a point Deputy Smith raised. There is 24-hour security in Crooksling at the moment. I think that's an important point to make. I just want to briefly mention the community engagement team. So between September 2023 and now, the CET has issued 63 briefings to our stakeholders, including public representatives, local authorities, local development companies and key departments and agencies. And within this, the CET has facilitated approximately 30 meetings with public reps, local development companies, community groups and residents. Others have involved direct engagement with public reps. Lots of phone calls, lots of online briefings, other more hands-on engagement, and in many cases, multiple on-site visits as well. And the CET has responded to queries and follow-ups on all briefings as swiftly as they can. The team are also engaging with other stakeholders outside of immediate openings of centres to build relationships and networks with key groups, and this includes meetings with community response for local development companies and other NGOs. And hopefully over the next couple of weeks and months, I'll be able to announce further supports for communities that are working on the ground as well. And I just want to echo Deputy O'Snuddig's praise of community groups that have stood up and helped us as well, and just to say that I'm doing my best to see if we can get more resourcing to help you in that regard. Just wanted to pick up on Deputy Riordan's point about that case of that individual man who was trying to get to Dundrum. That's not how we do things. That's not how it should have happened. I'd like to find out more. That might be difficult to do, but if someone needs to get to a location, we facilitate it. So something went wrong there, and just to apologise for that. So, of course, I accept that this system hasn't always operated the way everyone would like. However, I can assure deputies that actions are always taken with the health and safety of people as a priority, and that informs all decisions. Just to pick up on another issue as well, and Minister O'Gorman touched on it. This is in relation to use of potential use of accommodation that's being used for beneficiaries' temporary protection. So as the requirement for accommodation for Ukrainian nationals reduces, the International Protection Procurement Service is actively engaging with the Ukraine division of the department to utilise any suitable accommodation that may be becoming available. However, this is dependent on the agreement of the provider to accommodate international protection applicants. There's different types of contracts there, so we need agreement from the provider in that regard. Personally, I find it and have found it since December very distressing that we are in a situation where we're having difficulty providing enough accommodation, resulting in some people being accommodated. But I really would like to take this opportunity to ask every organisation in the state, be it state body or non-state body, to please look to see in your property portfolio, in your land portfolio, if you have something there that you think we might be able to use. And please contact us if you think there's anything there that's remotely usable, even temporarily, to help us to offer sanctuary to those seeking it in their hour of desperate need. And to conclude, Ceann Comhairle, and in the spirit of, I suppose, countering some of the less parliamentary behaviour earlier, I do want to thank the Social Democrats for raising this issue. It's been going on since December, and I frankly would have liked to been able to give it more profile before then as well. So I do want to thank Social Democrats for initiating a debate on this most urgent of issues. Thank you.
Yes?
It's inappropriate for certain people to say that elected representatives here hate the Irish people. I think that was totally out of order and should have been slapped down immediately. Because I would never say that to anybody, even though I disagree with their politics.
Thank you. I see that as a political charge, and it was a kind of a global comment. I don't think it can be taken as applying to any individual as such.
The loony left hates the Irish people.
Sorry?
The loony left hates the Irish people. I think that sort of language should be chopped down immediately.
Well, I would
sorry, I'm not telling you to do your job, but I just think it's...
that we had a more restrained debate on these matters and didn't enter into
but they're dog whistles.
Recriminatory. And if somebody has a complaint to make, I'll receive that complaint and deal with it. Now we go to conclude by hearing from Deputy Cian O'Callaghan and Deputy Jennifer Whitmore.
Gurv Margaret, Ceann Comhairle. So, firstly, I just want to agree with a point that has been made here that there is an untold story in Ireland that isn't getting the attention that it deserves, and it is the quiet work being done all over this country by people in communities who are supporting people who are seeking international protection. And you can see that in communities all across Ireland, and it doesn't get the attention that others get, but that is happening all across our country, and is something that I think many of us are very supportive of and very proud of. And you could see actually last weekend, I do want to talk about what happened last weekend, but I know in my constituency, a lot of people in my constituency last Saturday and Sunday were fundraising and getting equipment together, tents, sleeping materials, mats and other essential equipment to make sure that people who'd been brought out to Crooksling would have more than the very minimal that they were provided with at the time, and also to support people who didn't feel safe there and had returned into the city centre. And I think it is commendable that people stepped in to do that, but of course people shouldn't be feeling the need to step in for failures of what the state is doing. And we see this not just in terms of international protection, people seeking international protection. We see this all the time in terms of people sleeping in our streets or homeless, that a deficiency in services means that volunteers step in to try and breach those deficiencies, and then often get a lot of criticism from the very state agencies that are not doing enough to support people. The second thing I want to say, and this is not to take away from anyone's efforts in this area, and I appreciate this is a challenging area, but what has happened is the state has been dehumanising people in their treatment of people. There's no question that leaving people out in the street with no toilet facilities, no water, no support was anything but an abject failure of the state. It does dehumanise people fleeing war and persecution. And also it does have to be said that what happened last Saturday was not the right way to go about this. We had people effectively ordered onto buses at 8 a.m. in the morning without any notice, very little information, told that they could not bring bedding with them, just backpacks. The only information that they were given was told that they would be accommodated somewhere comfortable. They weren't told they were going to be accommodated in flimsy tents. They arrived at a site in the Dublin Mountains where there was soon protesters outside in a site that had been subject to an arson attack. And while the men had been taken away from the Main Street area, then their tents and their accommodation, the small amount of bedding and so forth that they had, which effectively was their homes, was then at that point removed and ripped up. And that resulted then last Saturday night in some of the people having no shelter at all is the situation they were in last Saturday night. So that is not the way to treat people. That is not a dignified way. It's not the kind of respect. And of course there should have been proper engagement. There should have been talking with people, information, and at least, notwithstanding any challenges that the state has in terms of the response, there would always have been time to treat people with a bit of dignity and respect and not be taking away from them their bit of agency, because that is very important. When you have nothing or next to nothing, your agency is really important. And the very least the state could do is not take away that agency. That's very, very important, and actually treat people as human beings in terms of the engagement with them. Look, what the situation of Crooksling is not the answer in terms of the very basic provision there. And time and again we are seeing, whether it comes to how international protection, people seeking international protection are treated, or challenges in health and housing and homelessness, we're seeing the state turning challenges into crises and turning difficult situations and sometimes unwittingly into flashpoints. And we need a much stronger leadership from the state in terms of providing the basic necessities when people need that. And what we don't need is more and more solutions that are private sector solutions leading to large profits for some providers rather than a state and a not-for-profit response. Margaret.
Deputy Whip North.
Thank you very much, Ciarán Comhairle. And I do want to acknowledge and thank the ministers for staying here for the whole debate. Oftentimes we'd have PMBs and the ministers wouldn't be in a position to stay for the whole thing. I want to refer to a comment that my colleague Deputy Gary Gannon said earlier on, and it really struck me, and that was, Minister, if I was sitting in your seat there and you were here and the current situation was happening, what would I hope that you would be doing? And what I would hope you would be doing is what we're doing, and that's raising it with you, jumping up and down, because I believe from your contribution and you know, from what I've heard of you say before, I don't believe that you think what happened is correct or right. And what we're trying to do is hold you to account on that, because there are failings and those people have been failed. And it's important, we have an important job here to do, and we're doing it today by raising it in the Dáil. I know it's really challenging, I know it's difficult. I would imagine that some days you wonder why you're doing it and how we are where we are. but we all have a role to play, and that's our role, is saying that actually you need to put a stop to this kind of treatment, and whether that's through you directly with the department or putting pressure on your government partners, because I do believe that that's where a large part of the problem lies. But as Minister, that is your role, and hopefully we will see a change in how this is all laid out. The reason it's so incredibly important, and it's I've been thinking about this a lot over the last few days. It's not just the issue of immigration, it's not just the issue of those men, it's not just the issue of making sure, which obviously is an incredibly important thing, that people's human rights are upheld. But this really, if we don't get this right, if you don't get this right, it is just going to create an Ireland that none of us ever would want to have seen. And there's a real risk for social cohesion. We have communities turning on each other at the moment. We're in a situation where people think that they can say, and actually they can quite freely say, things and use words and slurs that would never, ever have been acceptable before. And I think, we needed to really look outside. I mean, this has happened in other countries, and I think we missed an opportunity to look at other countries, to see what happened there, and to really double our efforts to make sure that it doesn't happen here. And unfortunately, we're past that point now. And I do understand, Ceann Comhairle, your comments in relation to the discourse earlier on. But what I'm seeing now is that, whether online or in discussions, personal discussions with people, or indeed in this chamber, if misinformation is happening, there's a responsibility on each of us to call it out. And using words like open borders would imply that we have them, and we don't. So I think we do need to start talking about these things. When we hear people say unvetted men, we need to point out to them, no one is vetted. No one in this country is vetted unless they're working with children or vulnerable people. We need to start having those conversations with people, and it's hard, and I know because I've done it. Military-age men, this is the kind of terminology that's just seeping into natural discourse. And if the silent majority, because I believe that most people don't want that here, if we don't talk and we don't push back, that becomes very, very normalised. And if on the floor of this Dáil we can have people here calling others, referring them to as loony, or completely disregarding EU law and essentially saying that there's no need for us as a state to apply this, I think there is a responsibility on each and every one of us to push back on that, because the risk is too high. It's way too high. And I don't know whether we're at that point of no return, but I think we have to absolutely do everything we can to try get on top of this and make sure that we don't go down that road any further. We need to treat people with respect, and that means everybody, and the state and its organs of the state need to do it as well. So look, we've laid out our position and our points, and I hope, Minister, that you'll take them on board, and I hope that you push back within your own government in instances where you feel that that's failing again. Thank you.